Okay, let's talk about organizing a little more. We've covered the principles, we understand what it is about, but there are factors that impact on the organization structures we eventually implement. What we're doing now is contemplating what those factors are. That becomes the next step in our journey. So, without further ado, let's have a look at my agenda for this session. First of all, we recognize that we must end up with factors, and you recognize if anyone were to test you or examine you on this, you would need to be able to provide this list or at least recognize it in a multiple choice test. The basis of organization is grouping jobs together. And those groups of jobs we already understand because we know that businesses are collections of functions. So the marketing function, for example, is something which undertakes the activity related to finding out what customers like, what customers want, where customers buy, how much they prepare to spend. But there are people who also take the orders, and they go out and they visit the distribution channels. If you are making tissue paper, for example, you visit Checkers and you speak to the buyers and you try and convince them to buy tissue paper from your firm. It's all part of the marketing activity, but it's a distinct job category. And then finally, I introduced to you in this session the types of organizational structures in a very broad sense. We'll return in lesson 9.2 to this in more detail. But for now, let me just give you some clarity, because this isn't really available in any book. There's a Greek word, organon, and it means tool or instrument. And that's where we get the word organization from. Organizations are simply tools to achieve organizational goals. And something we mustn't lose sight of is that those goals are met by people, human beings like you and like myself. We work and strive towards achieving an organizational goal which has been made dear to us by the people to whom we report. You've still got to join that job market, the workplace, but that's what you will find. You will hopefully, throughout your working careers, work for someone who motivates you and inspires you to work towards the company's goals. However, our intention here is to look at organograms or organization structure. So we must define that. And that's what you see in front of you. An organizational structure is simply a formal system. Okay. Now that formal system is something we can draw in the form of a chart. And what we do is we allow people to sit with pencil and paper and work out what that chart should look like in order to try and make it as effective as possible with regard to things like communication, for example, and reporting lines. In other words, who do I report to? Who will you one day report to? And why is that the most sensible way to coordinate us as resources? The nature of management is about arranging people together with technology and machines and money and markets and materials and measurement, all those M's, remember? And each of those things then starts to impact on the nature of the organizational design. So, for example, we see this relationship between technology and organization design. You recognize that if you have a whole lot of computer engineers working on software applications, that's going to be different to a whole lot of people who are building a house, for example, because the nature of the work is very different and the nature of the technology is very distinctive. And to that, of course, we add the environment of the firm as it is created with respect to organizational culture and value systems, the master plan of the firm, and then obviously the nature of the people that you have doing the work. So please remember these. They are absolutely essential. Okay. Now, let me give you a history lesson. This is not as old as time itself, but it is something we can date back to 1855. And McCallum drew up this organogram for a railway, and there it is. Isn't this the most wonderful bit of history? So we're going over here to 1855, exhibiting the division of administrative duties and showing the number and class of employees engaged in each department. I think that's the most fascinating thing. And there's an illustration from it. And clearly you can see the hierarchy. We've just taken a standard pyramid, which I draw on the screen for you with my marker, and we've turned it on its side. So there's the top of the pyramid, and there are the levels expressed horizontally now, or vertically rather, instead of horizontally. So do you want to know when we started using these? Much later than 1855. It was the early 1900s. And that kind of makes sense because you recognize that you had Fayol and Taylor back in the early 1900s, okay? But there was this consulting engineer, Willard Brinton, and he wrote a book in 1914, Graphic Methods for Presenting Facts. And I can tell you that you can, in fact, buy the book. It is available. It'll cost you a lot of money, and I don't recommend you do it because there's not an enormous amount, unless you're a collector of historic items. There's not an enormous amount you can do with it. But this book is now over 100 years old, and it's available on Amazon. What an amazing thing. So we know that if we started using organizational charts and graphical methods in the early 1900s, that it was probably linked to the guys who were talking to us about scientific management theory and bureaucratic theory. But we contrast classical organization theory with what we refer to as neoclassical theory of organization. And you will hear in your university career the word neoclassical used countless times. So I think I'd better define it for you. That's all it is. When we talk about neoclassical, what we mean is that we are adapting classical theory to give it a new twist, to try and modernize it, to try and make it fit. So let's embark now in the remainder of this lesson on distinguishing what we mean by classical theory and what we mean by neoclassical theory, and have a look at whether we can discern the differences. You understand scientific management theory, so I don't have to devote an enormous amount of time to this, nor do I have to devote an enormous amount of time to Weber's bureaucratic theory, because we did this in the early stages of this course. But what we know is that there are two primary classical theory approaches, scientific management and bureaucratic management, and the task then is to say, is there anything which contradicts that? And the neoclassical approaches say, yes, you should try and humanize it. Remember Mary Parker Follett? Well, she brought to us the notion that we should try and create a more humanistic organizational workplace. And that's what we mean by behavioral management. How does the manager set an example? How does the manager extract value out of the employees? How does the manager commit employees to organizational goals? In that notion of organization theory, what we make more prominent is individuals and groups and how they behave. That doesn't mean to say that we are taking away the importance of the science of work, but we're introducing here the nature of the individual working within the science of work. And what we discovered back in the 1930s and 40s, if you remember your studies early in the semester, productivity increases are considered to arise as a result of high morale, which is influenced by the amount of individual, personal, and intimate attention workers receive. So the goal here is to make people feel wanted, to inspire them, to motivate them. Can you begin to see that there are connections to leadership, perhaps? But we'll get to that at the end of the module. So individuals are not just instruments. They are not mechanical tools. They are social beings. and they they are different from each other in terms of how they pursue their desires, their value systems, and how they react, of course, how they react with social and economic factors. What their value systems are going to be material to what turns them on in the workplace. But very few people work as individuals. We end up working as work groups. And if we are working as work groups, then we're saying, what is it about work groups? Let me show you. We bind ourselves to groups with which we identify. We find a home for our thoughts and our values. We combine with other people because we just feel more comfortable there with that. And we talk about a sense of affiliation in psychology. Now, there are some groups we would like to join, like the in-groups, but we can't necessarily join them unless we change how we think, how we behave, how we dress, what we look like. Work groups, and if you'll forgive my spelling mistake on this slide, in the slide deck, work groups are regarded as secondary to primary social groups like your family, but the point is we wouldn't have the kind of social unrest or disharmony, for example, a high divorce rate, for example, if those groups were absolutely primary to us and we were looking after them. So we tend to look out for each other at work because we spend more time at work than we do at home, and it becomes absolutely core to our identities. We recognize then that we must draw people in. Neoclassical theory says draw people in and have them participate in the decision-making process. Do you see the differences? Classical approaches are about using science. They are mechanistic and they don't look at human beings. The neoclassical approaches are more informal, recognizing that people are social creatures. It means that classical organizational structure tends to be very hierarchical, whereas neoclassical structure tends to be flat. This is, if you get it right, cheaper and frequently far more effective than these structures, because over here, one person communicates to many people, whereas over here, one person communicates to two. The prospects of this communication being diluted as it reaches the bottom, or worker thoughts and feelings being diluted as they are sifted upwards to the great leader, that risk is far greater. However, the risk here is that one person has to look after many people, and sometimes that's not easy to do when these people are not independent thinkers and can't cope without receiving instruction, like these people who receive instruction, for example, from one person. Over here, 10 or 15 people reporting to one person creates a span of control, which is just too great if the work is complex. But let's summarize this, shall we? What are the factors that influence managers' choice of an organizational structure? Go back to it if you haven't grasped that. What is the logic of grouping tasks into job groups? And what are the types of organizational structure? What is the rationale that materializes in terms of classical theory and neoclassical theory? That's what it's about. And when we come back for lesson 9.2, the second half of this, we're going to be looking at the actual organizational types. Thank you for joining me.